When you had to move Right 1001 to an online unit of study, what were some of your priorities in the design of that?
The unit Right 1001 was always blended, so there were always some components that were online and some that were in person. And moving the entire course online, we had to think carefully about synchronous and asynchronous learning activities. Thinking about UDL in that context for me, I had to think about how an asynchronous learning activity could have several avenues for a student to reach a learning goal. But then the challenge for me was thinking about how a live online activity, let's say a Zoom tutorial, could have multiple ways for a student to achieve a learning goal. And ensuring that there was a consistency in my UDL approach across those synchronous and asynchronous learning activities was a challenge, but it was something with help from yourself and other people working on UDL at the university, I think we were able to achieve.
Can you give us an example of where you've changed an activity after thinking about it through a UDL lens?
So we have an activity in Right 1001 where students need to engage with political speech in order to understand concepts from the study of rhetoric. To do that, we had originally had one film about a politician on the course, and we asked all students to watch that film and write about rhetorical strategies used by a politician. I was worried that not all students could access the film and look to UDL strategies for how we might improve engagement. And by looking at the UDL strategies, I thought about multiple means of representation. So on the Canvas page where we ask students to think about political rhetoric by looking at this politician's speech, I added the film, and then using multiple means of representation, we added the film script and then original primary source political speech transcripts of the politicians' speeches from back in the 1970s. And that was a way to build 3 different pathways at least for a student to access the material that could help them think about political rhetoric. That changed then the way that I thought about that activity. It was no longer a film screening week or a week where everyone needed to look at a film. We had a week about this larger learning goal of understanding political rhetoric, and students now had 3 different avenues to explore that learning goal and reach that goal. With learning online during a global pandemic, it also meant that students studying internationally who couldn't access the film, there may have been censorship in their home countries or internet access issues, suddenly had other options for completing that learning activity and reaching that goal. So where previously a student might have just let that learning activity go because they couldn't access the material, now there are several options, and it's a more equitable learning activity for that reason. In a traditional learning environment only 3 years ago, before a global pandemic, you might have had a lecture on a Monday, a lecture on a Wednesday, and your tutorial on a Thursday, and there was a kind of chronological sequence for how students would engage with the content and work towards your outcome for that week. But using UDL in an online setting, it was kind of a two-way street through those 3 checkpoints in the week. So a student might show up for the first time in their online tutorial, but there's enough in the tutorial to motivate them to go back and look at the independent activity from earlier in the week or the lecture from even earlier in the week. So in a sense, any point in the week's learning activities could motivate students to look at other things happening in the unit. And for me, that was really exciting to know that if a student missed the lecture, that wasn't the end of their learning in that particular activity. They can go back to it and still find relevance to things we're doing at other points in the unit.
There are lots of very intentional strategies that you're employing as part of the design of your unit. Will you share those strategies with your students to make them aware of what you're doing?
I think students like hearing about the strategies you put in place and your goals, and it helps them understand what they're getting out of an activity. So we are aiming also to put some explanations into Canvas about why a page is designed the way it's designed, how it helps students achieve a certain learning goal, and so on. So this is an interesting development too, that in 2022, UDL actually becomes part of the conversation in Write 1001 for students.
Did you get feedback at all from students about having the multiple modes that they could access the one resource? Did you get any direct feedback from students about that?
Yeah, I was hoping for feedback where a student might say, I really liked looking at the film script or the primary sources. But I suppose the surprising feedback we got was from students who perhaps wouldn't have felt comfortable writing to me with a hesitation about watching the film a few years ago, but because we provided multiple pathways to that activity, they felt they could talk about their reluctance or their challenges working with a film. So some students, for instance, might have felt like some of the themes in the film, which we put up a little trigger warning before the film. So there were themes to do with suicide, gun violence, homophobia, and some students just didn't want to engage with that film, and that's their choice. But it shouldn't stop them from reaching the learning goal. So the students could then look at the script or the political speeches and still reach the outcome. Because there were those multiple pathways, students could come to me as a coordinator and say, I didn't feel comfortable because X, Y, Z. And that meant their personal experiences and their kind of validation or authenticity as a learner in that situation was more respected in the learning materials, because we weren't saying only students of this type can achieve this learning goal. So it actually created a really inclusive space where students were able to talk about their experiences, and that was unexpected. I thought it would simply be, I couldn't watch the film, so I did it this way, but students said, this is who I am, and so I did it this way. The challenge became keeping a UDL approach across those 3 different learning activities. The way we were able to do it in the tutorial space, which was where I personally felt it was a bit more challenging, was by creating several options for tutors to run activities that reach the same learning goal, providing agendas for students so they knew exactly what was happening ahead of time. And we even tried to connect to those previous 2 pages each week, the lecture and the independent learning activity, by having reading notes or example reading notes where students could catch up quickly before the tutorial. So even if a student was struggling in a particular week, they had a few options for being able to participate fully in that live tutorial each week.